Dear guests, dear speakers, I'd like to welcome you to the Einstein Forum, to the first full day of our conference on crisis of credibility. We had a very great start yesterday with an intense and insightful discussion with Franziska Schreiber, who left the AfD. This morning will be dedicated to conspiracy theories with two speakers, Michael Butter and Elliot Borenstein. Let me point out that at the Einstein Forum we skip the usual lengthy introductions to save time for the talks and for the discussions, but you'll find information on the speakers in our little brochure, and there should be plenty of them downstairs left. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Michael Butter. We're looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, good morning. Can you all hear me all right? Thanks for having me, and thanks for letting me kick off things. I think many of the things I have to say will go together rather well with what Franziska Schreiber talked about yesterday. When I began working on conspiracy theories about a decade ago, nobody really cared. I was a fellow at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies in southern Germany at the time, and it was only because of the Institute's PR manager that I talked to journalists about my research about once or twice a year. One question, usually the first question they invariably asked was, why do Americans believe so much in conspiracy theories? Implying that we, that is Germans and maybe Europeans, didn't. In recent years, this myth has been thoroughly dispelled. The events in Ukraine in 2014 and the so-called refugee crisis of 2015, which triggered the rise of the Pegida movement and of the right-wing populist party Alternative for Germany, have made the German public, and especially politicians and journalists, acutely aware of how widely spread conspiracy theories are not only in Germany, but all over Europe. It may still not be the case that more than half of Germans believe in at least one conspiracy theory, as political scientists Eric Oliver and Tom Wood found with regard to the United States in 2014. But as a number of recent polls show, and now I need to move on here, and this is magic, I didn't really touch it. And it worked. But as a number of recent polls have demonstrated, conspiracy theories are currently very popular in Germany. According to one study from 2017 conducted by the University of Mainz, and you see this up there, 17% of Germans believe that the moon landing was faked in a film studio. The same number of people thinks that the Bush administration orchestrated the attacks of September the 11th, 2001. 25% are convinced that Princess Diana was killed by the British Secret Service, and 9% think that Muslim immigration is part of a devious plot, the notorious Great Replacement, to annihilate the Christian population of Europe. Nobody then still believes that there are no conspiracy theories in Germany, but another myth about conspiracy theories prevails despite of the findings of polls, like the one just quoted, and another one has emerged because of the result of such polls. The myth that prevails is that conspiracy theorists are paranoid or suffer from other serious psychological problems. Ever since American historian Richard Hofstadter published his famous essay about the paranoid style in American politics in 1964, this has been the dominant frame for politicians, journalists, and scholars on both sides of the Atlantic to understand and explain why people believe in conspiracy theories. During the 2016 presidential election campaign, for example, many observers identified Donald Trump as a proponent of the paranoid style. Even Hillary Clinton alluded to this concept in the one speech in which she openly addressed Trump's predilection for conspiracy theorizing, claiming that he had, quote, built his campaign on prejudice and paranoia, unquote. Such a classification ignores the insights of much recent scholarship across the disciplines, which has severely criticized Hofstadter's arguments. For example, a number of scholars have argued that Hofstadter's conceptualization needs to be understood against its very specific historical background. It emerged at a moment when conspiracy theories were moving from the mainstream to the margins of society, and liberal intellectuals went to great lengths to delegitimize belief in them. Moreover, in light of the high number of people that believe in conspiracy theories, according to virtually every poll, classifying them as paranoid, be it in a clinical or a fuzzier metaphorical sense, simply does not make sense. When more than half of the population, or a significant minority like 20 or 30%, believes in conspiracy theories, it is obviously wrong to cast them as abnormal and not very helpful. In fact, given the numbers of recent polls and the prominence that some conspiracy theories and their advocates have gained in recent years, it appears that conspiracy theorizing is the new normal, that it is now more popular, widespread, and influential than ever before. This is the myth about conspiracy theories that emerged lately, and it is the myth that I want to spend more time today to challenge. I will argue that throughout the Western world, conspiracy theories were far more popular and influential in the past than they are in the present. Until after World War II, they constituted what the sociology of knowledge would call orthodox knowledge. That is knowledge that is firmly integrated in the societal mainstream and that is articulated, corroborated, and believed by ordinary people, elites, and experts. It was only at the end of the 1950s that conspiracy theories began to undergo a process of stigmatization that did not make them unpopular, but turned them into heterodox knowledge. That is knowledge no longer taken seriously by elites and institutions, but ridiculed and considered delusional or dangerous. Hofstadter's concept of the paranoid style marks in many ways the endpoint of that development. In recent years, though, conspiracy theories have made a comeback, and the internet has played a major part in it. However, conspiracy theories have not suddenly become so much more popular than they were for much of the second half of the 20th century. It is impossible to measure because nobody conducted polls in 1970 or 1990, but I think that there has been a modest increase with regard to the number of people who believe in them. This increase is mostly due to the fact that the internet has made conspiracy theories highly visible and easily available again, which they weren't in the decades after 1960, when they had mostly disappeared into rather secluded subcultures. However, conspiracy theories have definitely become more influential again. The voices of conspiracy theorists have become louder and are now constantly heard, discussed, and reacted to by those who do not at all believe in conspiracy theories. As Katharina Thalmann puts it, conspiracy theories still remain stigmatized, but, quote, that might not matter anymore, unquote, because they exert their influence nevertheless. One way to conceptualize the current situation is to say that the public sphere has been fragmented. The subcultures to which conspiracy theories were relegated for a while have evolved into counterpublics with their own media outlets and experts. And what happens in a public can, by the very definition, be observed and is observed by those still very skeptical about conspiracy theories. Thus, we are now living in a world in which conspiracy theories remain heterodox knowledge in some parts of the public, a public that this conference is part of and that one could maybe refer to, for sake of a better term, as the traditional public, and there are orthodox knowledge in other parts of the public. And you can tell from the slide that these days I do lots of talks for non-academic audiences. The heated debate about conspiracies and conspiracy theories that is currently going on in both Europe and the United States is a direct result of this situation. One part of the public worries about conspiracy theories and their harmful effects on society and democracy, and the other part worries about the same things with regard to conspiracies. Importantly, and this is where my talk speaks right to the topic of this conference, both sides accuse the other of favoring belief over facts, felt truths over actual ones. Thus, simply debunking conspiracy theories and spreading the facts won't make a difference. So other strategies have to be found, because especially populist leaders have shown very adept at forging alliances between those who believe in conspiracy theories and those who reject them, with very problematic effects, as we all know. Whereas scholars during the 1990s still assumed that conspiracy theories were an anthropological given, that is, that they existed in all cultures and at all times, most recent scholarship agrees that conspiracy theories are a product of European history. There are early forms in ancient Rome and Athens, but their modern form emerged during the early modern period, as Cornel Zwierlein has recently shown. As he and other historians have demonstrated, conspiracy theories were orthodox knowledge from the 17th far into the 20th century. They were believed by elites and ordinary people alike and corroborated by scholars. Nobody questioned their basic assumptions, that nothing happens by coincidence, that nothing is as it seems, and that everything is connected, as Michael Barkun famously defines conspiracy theories. In fact, the logic of cause and effect that the mechanistic worldview of the Enlightenment highlighted fueled conspiracist thinking considerably. To give just a few examples, the major driving force behind the American Revolution, as Bernard Bailyn already demonstrated in the 1960s, was the widespread perception in the colonies that the British Parliament, the governance ministers, and the king himself were pursuing what George Washington described as, and I quote, a regular systematic plan to make us tame and abject slaves, end of quote. But not only Washington believed this, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson did so too. Almost a century later, Abraham Lincoln and many others blamed the so-called slave power, an alleged secret organization promoting the interests of the slaveholders, for supposedly planning to extend slavery over the whole United States and wanting to enslave the white members of the working class as well. In his famous House Divided speech from 1858, Lincoln accused Senator Stephen Douglas, Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, former President Franklin Pierce, and current President James Buchanan of having orchestrated all major events of the 1850s to further the goals of the slave power conspiracy. In fact, as Eric Foner has argued, resistance to the slave power plot was the founding ideology of the Republican Party, which makes Trump, in many ways, the natural heir of that party. Another Republican president, but the Democrats, of course, weren't any better at that time. Another Republican president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, during the 1950s, was one of the many who believed in a large-scale communist plot against all American institutions. In Europe, the situation wasn't any different. In his Reflections of an Unpolitical Man from 1918, Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen, Thomas Mann blamed the Illuminati and the Freemasons for causing World War I. I quote the relevant passage in German because I could not get hold of a good translation last week. Die Geschichtsforschung wird lehren, welche Rolle das internationale Illuminatentum, die Freimaurer-Weltloge unter Ausschluss der ahnungslosen Deutschen natürlich, bei der geistigen Vorbereitung und wirklichen Entfesselung des Weltkrieges, des Krieges der Zivilisation gegen Deutschland gespielt hat. Was mich betrifft, so hatte ich, bevor irgendwelches Material vorlag, meine genauen und unumstößlichen Überzeugungen in dieser Hinsicht. 2 years later, Winston Churchill made a very similar argument about the Russian Revolution, and in fact all revolutions of the 19th century, blaming them on the Jews. From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt, so he's referring to Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Illuminati order, and turning him into a Jew in this argument, to those of Karl Marx, and down to Trotsky, Bela Kun, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It played, as a modern writer, Mrs. Webster, has so ably shown, a definitely recognizable part in the tragedy of the French Revolution. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century. As we all know, these suspicions about Jewish subversion took a genocidal turn in Germany a few years later. The Holocaust would not have happened without the immensely popular conspiracy theory of Jewish world domination fueling and legitimizing violence against this group. The Holocaust, however, was also an important factor in the stigmatization of conspiracy theories that began at the end of the 1950s and that affected the whole Western world. In the United States, problematization of conspiracy theories began within the social sciences and spread from there through the culture as a whole, as Katharina Thalmann demonstrates in a terrific book that came out earlier this year. On the one hand, writing under the impression of the war in Europe and the Holocaust, emigres from the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, Leo Löwenthal, or Norbert Gutermann, stressed the potential dangers of conspiracy theories for peace and democracy. On the other hand, scholars like Karl Popper criticized the epistemology of conspiracy theories, arguing that they overestimated intentional action and underestimated systemic conditions and structural effects. These studies did initially not have much impact outside of the ivory tower, but their ideas were picked up a few years later by a younger generation of scholars. No longer concerned with Europe, but with the effects of the Red Scare in the United States, scholars like Seymour Martin Lipset or Edward Shields picked up on and further developed these arguments against conspiracy theories to counter the widespread allegations that liberal scientists and intellectuals were puppets in a Soviet plot. Unlike the earlier scholarship, their studies reached a much larger audience, because they made an effort to write in an accessible way and because many journalists picked up on their ideas and popularized them. This popularization was further accelerated by the GI Bill, which paved the way to tertiary education for 2.8 million veterans about that time. The fate of the Red Scare conspiracy theory exemplifies how quickly conspiracy theories became heterodox knowledge. By the mid-1960s, it was no longer senators and congressmen who believed in it, but people like Robert Welch, a candy manufacturer from Massachusetts who founded the John Birch Society in 1958 in order to fight the communist conspiracy. The John Birch Society was not exactly a minority movement. By 1967, it had 80,000 members. But compared to the mass appeal that warnings of communist subversion had had a few years earlier, it was marginal. Moreover, the anti-communists of the 1950s voiced their suspicions in official government publications, through the national media, or in books that became bestsellers. Welch's publications, by contrast, such as the Blue Book of the John Birch Society or The Politician, in which he accused President Eisenhower of being a communist conspirator, were privately printed and distributed. The public, now worried more about the conspiracy theories of the John Birch Society, are no longer about communist or other subversion. As political scientists Joe Osinski and Joe Perrin pointedly put it, the data from the 1960s onward suggest one telling fact. We do not live in an age of conspiracy theories and have not for some time. Conspiracy theories must have undergone the same process of stigmatization in other parts of the Western world, be it the UK, France, or Germany. This is fairly obvious if one compares how conspiracy theories are talked about and who articulates them at the beginning and at the end of the 20th century. But there are no studies yet that trace this process for any of these countries. Moreover, conspiracy theories were not stigmatized in many other parts of the world, for example, Eastern Europe or the Arab world. There, they remain orthodox knowledge until today and thus function differently in public discourse. And you can find that out for yourself whenever you change planes at an Arab airport in the next couple of months or years. Go to the library there or the bookstore and look for an edition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. You will find one because it is reprinted constantly all over the Arab world. The stigmatization of conspiracy theories in the Western world did not mean, however, that conspiracy theories became unpopular. They never lost their commonsensical appeal, and it is safe to assume that belief in them remained widely spread. In the United States, some conspiracy theorists struggled to find a larger audience. For example, Harold Weisberg, who self-published Whitewash, his critique of the Warren Commission report, because he did not find a publisher. Other conspiracist indictments, however, for example, Oliver Stone's 1991 film JFK, were commercially very successful and reached a large audience. However, as Stone and many other conspiracy theorists experienced, their convictions could not be articulated with impunity in the public, and they were rejected and sanctioned by the media, academics, and other gatekeepers. Thus, explicit conspiracy theorizing, not to be confused with an often alarmist discourse on conspiracy theories, largely disappeared from the public sphere and moved into subcultures. The rise of the internet in the last 20 years has, without doubt, had a tremendous impact on conspiracy theories in the US and elsewhere. But it has not led to the complete mainstreaming and destigmatization of conspiracy theories as is often claimed. Even a casual glance at the alarmism with which the conspiracist allegations of Donald Trump have been discussed in most American media, and with which the conspiracy theorizing of right-wing populists in Europe are discussed, shows that conspiracy theories have not, maybe not yet, returned to the position at the heart of the mainstream and elite discourse that they occupied from the 17th century to the 1950s. The internet has not simply removed their stigma and turned them into orthodox knowledge again. However, the internet has clearly made them more influential again, and probably also slightly more popular. From the 1960s to the 1990s, conspiracy theorists shunned the mainstream and the mainstream shunned them, reporting on them critically and denying them access to its media channels and markets. Thus, conspiracy theorists often had problems circulating their ideas beyond the subcultures in which they moved. If their ideas made it into the general public, they were always already framed negatively by the mainstream media and its acknowledged experts. Think of the discussion about Stone's film JFK. The internet has changed this completely. Conspiracy theorists do not need the traditional media anymore to reach a large audience. They can set up their own websites and use social media platforms. Thus, their ideas are now far more visible and available than in the previous decades. This surely means that their counter-narratives appeal to more people again, and therefore it is safe to assume that there have been more convinced conspiracy theorists in recent years than in the decades before. But their number is almost certainly much lower than it would have been in 1914 or 1814 when conspiracy theories were still a widely accepted form of knowledge. Far more importantly, the internet has facilitated the emergence of counterpublics with their own media outlets and experts. Before I elaborate on this idea, a short caveat is in order, I think. I do, of course, not mean to imply that there used to be a single public sphere until very recently. I am, after all, not a naive Habermasian. But with regard to conspiracy theories, there has for a long time been a very broad consensus across different publics, so that for simplicity's sake, I speak of one public here. As long as conspiracy theories were still considered orthodox knowledge, people disagreed whether a specific conspiracy theory was true, but they did not challenge, at least not to the best of my knowledge, the foundations of conspiracism and thus did not reject this specific way of understanding the world as a whole. And since the stigmatization of conspiracy theories around 1960, there has been a similarly broad consensus condemning conspiracy theories. In Germany, for example, the tabloid Bild and the left-wing newspaper Taz may not have a lot in common, but they have always agreed on some basic facts and shared for decades basically identical assumptions about conspiracy theories, which of course does not mean that individual journalists are not occasionally drawn to conspiracy theories nevertheless, especially if they come along in veiled rather than too explicit language and tend to confirm the prejudices and ideas they harbor anyway. But let me return to the emergence of counterpublics with regard to conspiracy theories. In the 1990s, somebody like Alex Jones in the United States still needed radio stations to reach a national audience. The internet has made him independent and allows him to reach people from all over the world. Likewise, a news outlet like Breitbart, where conspiracy theories also thrive, would have been impossible without the internet. In Germany, the Kopp publishing house from Rottenburg near Tübingen led a niche existence until a few years ago when its website made it known in the whole German-speaking world. Today, Kopp apparently sells several thousand books a day, most of them with explicit conspiracist content. More importantly, an increasing number of Germans get their daily news no longer from traditional public or private TV channels or even newspapers, but from websites such as Nachdenkseiten, Rubicon, or KenFM. These alternative, or as they like to refer to themselves now, free media, do not agree on everything, but there is one thing that they have in common, and that is the firm conviction that large-scale conspiracies, usually by the United States or sinister parts of the elite and directed against the unwitting German people, are history's major driving force. Conspiracy theories thus function as perfectly orthodox knowledge in these outlets and the public that they are part of, again. Whereas the traditional public worries about the effects of conspiracy theories, the counter-public is concerned with the fatal effects of conspiracies and consider the denial of large-scale plots the real problem. Importantly, the alternative media of the counter-publics can rely on their own set of experts who come with, at least at first sight, rather convincing journalistic or academic credentials. The debate on 9/11, for example, which is generally considered to have been an inside job ordered by the Bush administration, is led by journalists who used to work for renowned newspapers or public broadcasting and who at one point stepped from the mainstream into the alternative media, from one public into the other. These journalists regularly interview scientists and other academics who either try to poke holes into the official version of 9/11 or claim that the Twin Towers and World Trade Center 7, the third building that collapsed in New York that day, were brought down by controlled demolition. The evidence these experts offer usually falls into one of two categories. Historians like Daniele Ganser, who received his PhD from the University of Basel and later founded his own peace research institute, usually highlight that the US has a long history of deception and conspiracy in order to justify regime changes and the invasion of foreign countries. Physicists like Ansgar Schneider, I haven't found out where he got his PhD from, question the official explanation that the planes brought down the Twin Towers and debris from the South Tower damaged World Trade Center 7 so that it also eventually collapsed. What the arguments have in common is that they continuously stress that those who still believe that Al-Qaeda conducted the attacks are ideologically misled and ignore rather obvious scientific facts, favoring felt truths or truthiness, to borrow comedian Stephen Colbert's term, over real truth. Just a few days ago, for example, on June 30, journalist Paul Schreier referred in a tweet to an interview with physicist Ansgar Schneider that had first been published by Rubicon a few weeks ago and had now been republished by KenFM. Schreier quotes Schneider, who says that journalists should acknowledge that there is a debate about 9/11 going on that they do not quite understand and that they should therefore ask the experts about. Schreier concludes the tweet with the words, "How true." Now, I talk to journalists and other people about 9/11 and other conspiracy theories all the time because they want to understand what 9/11 conspiracy theories are about. But in the eyes of Schreier and Schneider, I am of course not really an expert because I am either ideologically misguided, paid by the CIA, or just too stupid to understand the scientific facts. It is therefore no surprise that in the second part of the interview, which Rubicon published a couple of days ago, Schneider says that I am emotionally not capable of accepting the obvious facts. I am so invested in the official version that I deny reality. He recuses me of Realitätsverweigerung and seek to disqualify all those who threaten my beliefs and conviction as conspiracy theorists. I do not draw on this example here to seek your pity, which would be welcome nevertheless, though, but because this episode exemplifies the crisis of traditional expertise that this conference is concerned with. In another interview, Schneider suggested that I have to say the things I say in order not to lose my job. And my favorite one-star review of the popular book I wrote about conspiracy theories that came out last year on Amazon, now unfortunately deleted, was just 2 sentences. The author is professor at the University of Tübingen. That says it all. And the problem, I think, is not Tübingen. The problem is that if you are a professor at an established institution, you are automatically part of a group that is considered to be either stupid or intentionally lying and that therefore cannot be taken seriously. At the same time, the episode exemplifies the way that the way in which conspiracy theorists talk about us is exactly the way in which we, myself often included, talk about them, that they favor feelings over facts, that they ignore the evidence that is out there. The German description of the conference online, the English version is slightly less direct when it comes to that, asks what intellectuals and experts can do to overcome the crisis of credibility of traditional expertise. When it comes to convinced conspiracy theorists, the pessimistic answer I have to give is not much. Conspiracy theorists do not acknowledge that those who challenge their convictions, whatever academic credentials they have, as experts. They regard them at best as idiots and at worst as parts of the conspiracy. A favorite argument of conspiracy theorists, reiterated once again yesterday in an op-ed on the website KenFM, is the completely wrong claim that the term conspiracy theory was invented by the CIA to protect the lone gunman version of the Kennedy assassination, and that the term therefore is nothing but a weapon to disqualify unwanted truths. Thus, pointing out that something sounds a lot like, or even is, a conspiracy theory won't work in these discussions. And stressing the real facts won't work either. When experts from the traditional public highlight facts about 9/11, the migration crisis, the burning of Notre Dame, or any other event that has sparked conspiracy theories, conspiracy theorists are very good at either ignoring them or turning them into evidence for their claims. What the facts do not do is challenge their beliefs. In fact, there is empirical evidence that convinced conspiracy theorists believe even more in their claims after they have been confronted with conclusive evidence that they are wrong. This is because this evidence threatens their identities, which hinge on the belief in the conspiracy, and therefore they do not accept it or maybe even turn it around. This is, of course, so much easier now than it was a few decades ago. No conspiracy theorist is isolated these days. All are part of larger online communities whose members constantly reaffirm their convictions. We talked about the village idiot yesterday. And all of them participate in the counter-publics I have described, whose experts provide them with strategies and arguments to reject the claims of the experts from the other public. This does not mean, however, that we should stop debunking or analyzing conspiracy theories, not only because I wouldn't know what to do then, but more importantly, because among our audiences, and also that was brought up yesterday too, there are still many people receptible to the facts as we understand them, people who might be drawn to conspiracy theories but who are not yet convinced believers. But what is even more important, I think, is thorough education. People, and obviously the people we can most easily reach are young people because they have to go to school, need to learn how non-conspiracy theorists and conspiracy theorists generate facts and truths, and why the way non-conspiracy theorists do it is superior. I say generate on purpose because I'm a constructivist, and I believe that all facts and truths are in the end constructed. But I also believe that some ways of constructing facts are better than others. Quite independent of everything that might be wrong and problematic about conspiracy theories, this is important because I am convinced that societies cannot tackle the big challenges of the 21st century, from climate change to migration, if they are fundamentally divided not merely on the facts, but also on the way that facts are generated. And with regard to conspiracy theories more specifically, the ones who have in recent years been most successful at bridging the gap between those who believe in such theories and those who don't have been the leaders of populist movements that have emerged throughout the Western world. The German Alternative für Deutschland, for example, does this by not articulating conspiracy theories in public too explicitly in order not to alienate supporters who do not believe in them, while simultaneously sending veiled signals to the convinced conspiracy theorists. Donald Trump, by contrast, can articulate conspiracy theories more openly because in the highly polarized political landscape that is the contemporary US, he knows that convinced Republicans will always vote for him anyway, although they might find his conspiracy theories disturbing. All this, however, would be the subject of another talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for your talk. And I see we have the first. Okay, Susan first.
Thank you for your talk. I have two problems with it. One is a little smaller, so I'll mention it first. I confess to having an allergy towards Enlightenment bashing. But when you said early on that the Enlightenment played a role in this by introducing notions of cause and effect, I think one has to think about what was before that. Namely, historical events were caused, if not directly by witchcraft, which was a standard explanation in lots of circles, by the design of providence. Okay, which, if you like, is a conspiracy of one, but there is an invisible hand guiding human action. So I found that problematic. But what I find most problematic is the following. There are real conspiracies. If a conspiracy is definable as the secret efforts of people in power to manipulate facts in order to achieve certain ends, at the very, very latest, let's say with the justification of Hiroshima, facts that still don't have a wide reach in the American public, But certainly what we found out about the Vietnam War through Daniel Ellsberg, who just described all over the place. I can remember one line, you have, the president needs 5 more lies in half an hour, give it to him. And certainly with the Iraq War, what we have is enough awful knowledge about the ways in which very powerful government organizations have conspired to realize certain ends and lie to us about them. And I think, you know, before we damn conspiracy theorists tout court, we really need to look at the actual things that have happened to undermine general trust in official sources of power, which have certainly led many reasonable people who are not, you know, the village idiots at all. I'm not convinced by the Warren Report, frankly. It doesn't make sense to me at all. So I just wonder how your views take account of the fact that there have been, in the second half of the 20th century, very clear examples of conspiracies that have had enormous impacts.
Okay, thank you. Maybe enlightenment first, so I didn't mean to engage in enlightenment bashing here. And of course the argument that you hinted at is a very old argument that you basically first find in the writings of Karl Popper, that conspiracy theories are an answer to the disenchantment of the world, because people no longer believe in providence, but they don't want to accept chaos and coincidence. They are not quite ready yet to theorize things with the means of the modern social sciences. So basically the conspirators replace God as those who plan everything. It's slightly more complicated than that, and I think this is just something that we can accept, that in the Enlightenment, the conspiracy theories that we still know today about the Masons, about the Illuminati, they really emerged. So the one essay I would point you to with regard to that is one from 1981. That is Gordon Wood's essay on conspiracy and causality in the American Revolution, where he basically tries to bring together the argument by Bernard Bailyn, the founding fathers all believed in these conspiracy theories, and the argument by Richard Hofstadter about the paranoid style, because what happened after Hofstadter had made his point and people had read Bailyn is that they came along and said, oh God, were the founding fathers paranoid? And so Wood comes along and says, no, they weren't, because it was perfectly normal to believe these things at the time, because people believed that the moral quality of an action was the same as the moral quality of the intention that generated this action. And therefore, if people all the time do things that harm you, but they tell you, no, I don't intend to harm you, they must be lying and there must be a plot going on. So Wood is very, very good on, in a way, disentangling the history of ideas behind that, so no Enlightenment bashing. With regard to the second question, you're perfectly right. There have always been real conspiracies, and there always will be real conspiracies. I wouldn't say that this is a domain of the 20th century or the second half of the 20th century. We can go back to the assassination of Julius Caesar, for example. I think there are, in general, though, a couple of differences between how real conspiracies historically play out and what conspiracy theorists then very often claim about either these events or other events. I'm not convinced by the Warren Report either, but I also don't think that my favorite, though, is that follow-up report where they conclude that it may have been 2 shooters who independently of each other decided to kill Kennedy, same time, same place, but who were not in collusion with each other. I think that comes out in the 1970s, because people try to avoid this language of conspiracy so much. But I think it's a big step from saying there might have been a conspiracy, meaning a couple of people involved to that, in saying this was the large-scale government takeover that had long been planned by the military-industrial complex. So I think this is where conspiracy theorists very often make what Hofstadter calls this curious leap in the imagination. You begin with something that is observable and it's justifiable, and then suddenly it becomes this very, 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 very big thing. Conspiracy theorists also usually assume that the conspirators are all powerful. They just don't make any mistakes, and everything works out fine. And we know with the Iraq War that it didn't work out fine. I think had this been a large-scale conspiracy, they probably would have found weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, because it's so easily to stage that you find that. Actually, I think the build-up to the Iraq War wasn't really a conspiracy theory. I think what happens there is that the people in power tell the secret services all the time, we need evidence that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. And this goes down the chain, and everything that comes up is then filtered accordingly until they get the information that they want, and then they act accordingly. And we also see then, of course, that if we go, for example, to the Julius Caesar example, that history often escapes the conspirators. In that, I mean, why do people kill Julius Caesar? They kill him because they want to preserve the Roman Republic. Well, Caesar's dead, but the Roman Republic was dead too either. And I think this is very much true of real conspiracies, that they might reach their goals short term, but then they might actually fall short of reaching their midterm or long-term goals. And I think that one problem with these large-scale conspiracy theories is that they delegitimize their own justified critique of what people in power are doing. I think there are tons of reasons why one needs to criticize how the Bush administration capitalized on the 9/11 attacks in so many different ways. But I think you just, in a way, make it easy for people to dismiss this critique if you claim that the Bush administration also conducted the 9/11 critiques. And I think that, therefore, one needs to be careful where a careful analysis of power structures that should always also pay attention to real conspiracies, because I completely agree with you, they occur and they will always be occurring, then in a way crosses the line to become a conspiracy theory that cannot really be corroborated by facts, and that makes, I think, untenable assumptions about how a small group of human beings can control history.
Susan asked my first question, so I'll go ahead straight to my second question. Just throwing in a little piece that supports what Susan was asking about. In the 80s, I was active in the Polish underground movement, and I identified a new psychiatric disorder. I'm a psychologist by training, which I called reverse paranoia, being the completely unjustified feeling of not being followed. But though we need to accept the fact that conspiracies actually exist and have an impact on the real world, I think that there are two elements to that statement that need to be differentiated. One is the existence of conspirators, and the second is the existence of agency independent of the conspirators. To give an example, again, in my activities in the underground, I received money from abroad, including from the National Endowment for Democracy. And only years later it transpired that this was CIA money. Now, had I known it was CIA money, I would not have accepted it. I didn't know that. And the fact that it was CIA money didn't make any impact on what we were doing, right? So one possible instrument in trying to differentiate legitimate interpretation of historical events to conspiracy is independent agency of the actors the conspirators are trying to influence. And I'd be curious to hear your comments on that.
I would completely agree with you. I think this is an excellent... You want to add to this right away?
Can I add just a
Sure.
very short comment?
Sure,
It's
of course.
really a footnote because it's the same. It goes
Of
in
course.
the same direction. I think a great deal of contemporary politics is characterized precisely by its capacity to be removed from the public eye and by the capacity of lots of groups and very powerful people. For example, think about the connection between big banks and political power. The role of Goldman Sachs, for example. So one characteristic of modern power is precisely the fact that it is removed from the public eye at the very same time that we live thinking that everything is transparent. And from time to time, such conspiracies, the ways in which one big lobby has been able to influence policy comes to our knowledge. This would seem to constitute a very legitimate ground for then forming conspiracy theories. So that's only a footnote. I think conspiracy theories are the, in a way, legitimate, normal outcome of the structure, the very structure of modern political power and the transnational connections removed from a public eye that exist.
Yeah, beginning maybe with the footnote, I would completely agree in that I would say this isn't something that has happened recently, but Zwierlein would make the argument that this is exactly what happens during the European wars of religion in the 1580s, that the world becomes more complex, power seems to become more opaque, and therefore conspiracy theories become an answer to that. So, which is why conspiracy theories are so intimately linked to the emergence of modernity and in all its facets. Coming back to your point, I would completely agree with you, which is why I, in a way, just take this as an opportunity to make maybe 2 points. I think what conspiracy theories usually underestimate is that there are other groups that possess agency as well, because they imagine the group of the conspirators as this homogeneous group. They are all having the same interest. The whole Secret Service, the CIA or the American government, they're all working in unison. It's not that there are different factions who have their separate agendas, but they're all of one mind, which is not how the world works. Jovan Byford, a British social psychologist, also has made the point that a good argument against large-scale conspiracy theories is that there are so many conspiracies. Different groups are conspiring, and therefore, in a way, they're blocking each other. But another comment on this concept of agency, because that ties up with something that came up yesterday, the question of men being drawn to populist parties, and there being quite a number of studies now pointing to the fact that at least when it comes to overtly political conspiracy theories, that they appeal more to men than to women. There's a concept developed by an American literary scholar, Tim Melley, which is called agency panic. And Melley argues that this is characteristic of the post-war United States, where people feel that they no longer possess any agency, and especially, of course, white men feel that they no longer possess any agency, and therefore conspiracy theories become a way to deal with this agency panic. And I think that this is a concept that can be very easily adopted to contemporary Germany, to the Trump movement, and to many different other contexts, because it really explains what many of these conspiracy theories are actually about. On the one hand, you understand why you don't seem to possess any agency, because the conspirators have all the agency. On the other hand, and this is what Franziska also talked about yesterday, you then assume for yourself a privileged position that kind of reconstructs your agency, because you think that you belong to the small group, the elite that has understood what is actually going on. So thanks for bringing that up.
So,
Thank you very much. My question is exactly related to this. I think recent research points to obviously the fact that there is one group that excels and stands out most when it comes to sharing all sorts of crap, falsehoods, conspiracy theories online, and that's 60 plus as an age group, mostly male. So my question is, do you have any evidence or knowledge, insights, socio-demographic groups, age groups, whatever, where conspiracy theories resonate most?
Mm-hmm. This is a very complicated question, because there is a mixed evidence. So one of the things I do is that I am co-chair of a big European project that brings together scholars from many disciplines. There are lots of psychologists and political scientists in there who conduct polls and surveys all the time. And when it comes to age, they, interestingly enough, usually don't find any difference in ages. There are studies that point to the fact that older people are more likely to believe things that they encounter online than younger people. But of course, there's tons of qualitative research, ethnographic studies, online ethnographies, other things that tend to highlight that the observation, that in a way tend to confirm your observation that it tends to be rather older people than younger people, or maybe they're more outspoken about that. So one email I got told me, when I said, well, it's mostly men over 50 who believe in these conspiracy theories, I got an email that said, yeah, because that's the only group that can still think. Women could never think, and younger people have never been taught to think for themselves. When it comes to gender, the interesting thing is that for a long time, empirical studies didn't find any gender difference. But I think that might be because the inclination to conspiracy theorizing might be the same for men as for women. And what many psychologists do is that they just give questionnaires to their students, and therefore, in a way, they find certain tendencies. There aren't by now other studies that actually find that men are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories than women, at least these overtly political ones. So the Mitte-Studie by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation that came out a couple of weeks ago found that men are, I think, 25% more likely to believe in conspiracy theories than women. At the same time, however, this might also be really milieu-specific and depending on the type of conspiracy theory. So I come from Tübingen, a very left-wing, wealthy, liberal city. When you're in a playground there, you shouldn't bring up the topic of vaccinations when you're not sure who's sitting next to you, because there might be very well-educated young mothers sitting next to you who might have very strong opinions about vaccinations. So it might also depend on the type of conspiracy theory. But generally, when it comes to the political ones, I think you're perfectly right.
So I have three more people on the list. I would like to close it after that. But next one is Misha Gabovic.
Thanks. I'd like to return to the historical part of your argument, where you said that it used to be normal to engage in conspiracy theorizing, and the main historical change has been a delegitimization of those theories. Now, if that is the case, one would expect that the old mainstream of conspiracy theorizing would have left its mark or left a trace in social science approaches to explaining reality. And I actually can think of at least one example, which is from Spanish history, where one of the main tropes of people in Spain writing about Spanish history is the black legend, the leyenda negra, where the idea is that everybody has always been saying bad things about us, as if our colonization had been worse than other cases of colonization, and people are exaggerating the Spanish Inquisition and its crimes, etc., etc. And the first person who really kind of popularized this idea was an extremely interesting early 20th century intellectual, very well educated, etc., but who in his book kind of engaged in quite a bit of conspiracy theorizing. And now the most recent intellectual bestseller in Spain, 25 editions, is by a conservative intellectual who sort of takes up this idea, but with an interesting twist where she tries to develop a kind of general theory of imperiophobia. And she says that all empires throughout history, starting with the Roman Empire, have always had their detractors from among intellectual elites linked to kind of waning states who are losing out to the expansion of empire. So to me, I mean, she still has some kind of conspiracy theory elements, but to me this is a very interesting evolution from something that's mostly conspiracy theory to something that's at least trying very hard to be social science with a small residue of conspiracy theory. And I'm wondering whether you would agree that this, whether you would see this as a general tendency that fits your story about, the waning legitimacy of conspiracy.
Yeah, I would completely agree. So thanks for bringing that up. I think there's still a big book to be written about that that traces that in detail. But just to give you two examples, one is I think that large passages of Foucault, if you replace discourse with conspirators, work perfectly well, because I think that's one of the tricks that social science has played, that you, in a way, you say, well, there's just these things happen. It's no longer individuals doing that. It's just happening. We don't really know quite how it happens, but it happens. And I think...
He does it himself when he speaks about programs of truth.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing is, and there I would point to a really wonderful book about conspiracy culture by Peter Knight, an Americanist from Manchester. He has a very interesting chapter on popular feminist analyses, Betty Friedan, Naomi Wolf, And what he demonstrates through really good close readings is that they describe patriarchy as if it was a conspiracy. So it's a metaphor. Conspiracy is a metaphor in many ways, but then there are always these moments where in a way this flips, where they explicitly say, yeah, this all is no coincidence, and it sounds like you might think it's a conspiracy, but it's actually true and all that. So this would be the second example, but there's still a big book to be written about that traces this whole process more thoroughly, and that then also in a way integrates the Bruno Latour argument in a better way than has been done so far, because Latour, I think 20 years back, already wrote an essay where he thinks maybe the social sciences have given rise to conspiracy theories, whereas of course historically, as I try to explain, it's actually the other way around, but it might be a back and forth between conspiracy theory and the social sciences that could be described in more detail.
Sorry, can you just repeat the name of the author of that article?
The last one, Latour, Bruno Latour, Peter Knight, University of Manchester. And the book is called Conspiracy Culture, From Kennedy to the X-Files.
Philip Kitcher.
Well, first, thank you very much. Everybody else so far has been focusing on the conspiracy theory part of your talk. I want to turn epistemological and go for the concept of the public. You didn't tell us how to individuate publics, and I think it's very tempting to think in terms of what I'm going to call a hard public. A hard public is a group of people who accept a common set of authorities and will not respond to information that is transmitted to them or transmitted towards them by non-authorities, and who will talk and listen only to one another. Now, one might actually chart the history of conspiracy theories not by looking at the theories themselves, but by looking at the structure of the public and the ways in which the public is divided. So one might think that there are cases of what one might call softer publics, where certain individuals in the group who will be conduits of information to other members of the group are, as it were, permeable. And so one might think of this in terms more generally of a network structure along which information can flow, and one might want to trace the history not in terms of the fascinating stories about conspiracy theories that you told us, but the ways in which the structure of this network changes over time. That is, the breakdown of the successive narrowing of the number of channels within the network through which information can flow. And what is perhaps troubling for people today in the age of the internet is the thought that what you're getting is much less communication from potential experts to people who are taken in by, as it were, makers of false facts, conspiracy theories, and so I actually would invite you from an epistemological point of view to think not so much in terms of the theories themselves. Conspiracy theories have always been with us, and perhaps, but the ways in which the character of the public and the public's responsiveness to sources of information change over time. And I wonder whether the story might be different if you told it that way. And I wonder whether the problem with which you're wrestling at the end, I mean, you know, there's a sort of normative turn towards the end of what you said today, might better be approached in terms of trying to fathom ways in which network structures can be repaired and modified in ways that make for more profitable debate. Again, this relates to what Franziska Schreiber was saying last night. She was trying to find ways in. I don't think it's enough to stop with the norms that she gave us of, you know, being responsible and kind and listening and so on and so forth. There may have to be more sort of systematic social changes that are needed in order to get these debates to be profitable and constructive. But let me just suggest that to you as a sort of an abstract epistemologist's approach to trying to understand this problem in a different way.
Thank you very much. I think I'll just take that because I think this is a very good good idea, and of course something I had been working on conspiracy theories for quite a while until I started thinking about the public or publics, so therefore I naturally came from the other direction, but I think it would make a lot of sense to turn things around. It's all been suggested to me by a colleague that one could think about this in terms of social systems theory, this moment of delegitimization, one of basically where just a social system splits up from the others and becomes in a way self-enclosed. And of course you're also perfectly right that my talk was in a way two-parted. One is a very probably neutral analysis, and the other is one where I'm struggling with how does one deal with that, which I think is what many people are struggling with at the moment, and me maybe in particular, because most talks I give these days are in schools or for the German Secret Service or people who want to learn about conspiracy theories and people who want to deal with conspiracy theories. And it's always very difficult to, when you're talking, for example, to the Bundesnachrichtendienst, not to make them think that all conspiracy theorists are dangerous and that they should take away their civil rights right away, but actually to come up with a more nuanced perspective. And it's, I think, something that we're struggling with, and that's maybe the larger point of my argument that I could have made clearer, with this crisis of expertise and what I call the fragmentation of the public, of course not only with regard to conspiracy theories, but to all other kinds of things as well. It's only, I think, that we see it so particularly well with regard to conspiracy theories, because there you have one part of the public worried about the one thing and the other part worried about the other thing, and you see this clash all the time. And I think this is also something that maybe was a little bit de-emphasized yesterday, the idea, or maybe came across wrong yesterday, the idea of echo chambers and filter bubbles. I think we've always been living in filter bubbles and echo chambers. During the presidential campaign of 1800, Jefferson versus Adams, the supporters of Adams claimed that Jefferson is dead for weeks. And then newspapers corroborate that story. And people believe that because they're always living in these bubbles. I think what's actually happening in the present is, and this is what we're struggling with, is this idea of what the media scholar Bernard Perksen has called the filter clash. That we're in our bubbles, but we also constantly see that other people are of a different opinion. And this is why we're so angry all the time when we're online, because we see all of these idiots who don't understand how the world works. And we don't think that they might be right. We just get excited about that. And then we talk to our peer group and the people in our bubble, and we reaffirm our beliefs that these are idiots and that we are the ones that are right. And I think this is a very problematic situation. And I like this idea of the hard public. And I'll come back to that. I may have more questions about that later on. I'll approach you then. Thank you.
So we have one last question by Hermann Grimmeis.
We have recently experienced enormous improvements within information technology. Artificial intelligence is only one example. But you know, in a few years, one person will have access to information amounts which so far only institutions like the CIA had. So my question is, will these technology support the conspiracy theorist or the other way around?
I think it's both. So the history of conspiracy theories, and this has been done in some ways already, could also be written as a history of different media regimes, of course, and how these media regimes impact on the structures of conspiracy theories, for example. So whenever I teach conspiracy theories, my students are very excited, and then they get very bored. Because if you look at 18th or 19th century conspiracist texts, they're incredibly boring. It's like, and even in the 20th century, if you take Welch's The Politician, it's 200 pages and 150 pages of references. It's very, very boring. Once the internet emerges and you get YouTube and you get these 90-minute clips, loose change, zeitgeist, and so on, conspiracy theory becomes exciting. And the latest change that we see is one that is related to things like Twitter. Two American political scientists in a book that came out a couple of weeks ago, Charles Moorhead and Nancy Rosenblum, make the argument that what we now find is what they call conspiracy without theory. In that you just make a claim, but you don't provide the evidence anymore. You don't bring out the sources because you have only 140 or 280 characters on Twitter. You make a claim to your peer group, and people will like that. And they make the argument, which I think is slightly overstated, that this is more about generating assent than generating true belief. I'm not sure about that, but definitely media technologies have always are very, very important. Also, of course, the access to information. So everybody can become a conspiracy theorist now, which is great, that you can always question the official versions that you get there, which is fantastic, and which also in Germany generated a lot of conspiracy theories during the Ukrainian crisis in 2014, where the German media were really not very good at reporting on what was going on there. So many people went online, went to different sources, and this is where a lot of the distrust of the media that we're currently still experiencing actually emerged, because they realized they weren't really getting the real story from the public news outlets in Germany. And then, of course, they made the step that they just began to question everything, and they started to then trust other outlets without questioning them. But yeah, there's definitely a connection.
I'm primarily thinking of hackers.
Sorry?
Hackers.
I'm primarily thinking of hackers.
Mm-hmm.
Hackers.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, hacking, of course, WikiLeaks is something that is important to many conspiracy theories, but then, of course, if the evidence doesn't fit, conspiracy theorists just ignore it. I mean, of course, NSA Snowden has sparked conspiracy theories. Trump, when he made claims about Hillary Clinton, referred to WikiLeaks. But, for example, WikiLeaks a couple of years ago published a lot of audio files from September the 11th, 2001. And what these audio files showed was that nothing unusual happened that day. So conspiracy theorists simply chose to ignore it because it didn't corroborate their narrative, so they didn't care. Of course, hacking has been important because probably the best piece of evidence that a conspiracy theorist can get is a renegade. Somebody who says, I was part of the conspiracy and I no longer am, and I can tell you what the communists or the Catholics or whoever are up to. And the second best thing is an allegedly secret document, the internal communication of the conspirators that seems to prove what they are up to. And of course, the protocols of the Elders of Zion would be such an alleged secret piece of communication. And hacking has become very important for getting hold of such pieces that then allegedly prove that there is this big plot going on.
So I would like all you to join me in welcome. No.
Yeah. Welcome. Thank you.
And I think this has been a very intensive hour, so I would like to give you a chance to grab a very quick coffee and return here immediately for the next talk.